Is Donald Trump on a relentless quest to corner Iran? The US president accuses OPEC of manipulating oil prices and urges allies to boost production as he's reimposing sanctions on Iran. He's also threatened countries still doing business with the Iranians. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. Oil production, prices and politics require a delicate balance. Donald Trump is urging oil-producing countries except Iran to boost output. He hopes that will keep prices low and motorists happy with cheaper fuel as he tries to force the Iranians out of the market. Well, Trump's pressuring allies to stop buying Iranian oil as a tactic to make Iranian leaders negotiate a new nuclear deal after he pulled out of the 2015 agreement 2 months ago. Iran says it will find ways to export its oil despite Trump. We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, Heidi Jo Castro has more from Washington, D.C.
President Donald Trump increased his pressure on Saudi Arabia by appearing on Fox News and saying that he was 100% sure that OPEC is manipulating the oil market. He went on to say that, quote, they better stop it because we're protecting those countries, many of those countries, and it is no secret that the country he is referring to there is Saudi Arabia. Trump's appearance on Fox News comes on the heels of a tweet he issued yesterday in which he claimed that the King of Saudi Arabia, King Salman, had promised him during a call, or had agreed rather, to increase Saudi Arabian oil production by as much as 2 million barrels a day. The White House, though, quickly backpedaled on that assertion, following Trump's tweet with a clarifying statement saying that Saudi Arabia had only indicated that it can raise oil production if needed. Further contrasting Trump's claim is Saudi Arabia's statement itself, which made no mention of any increase in production amount. But the fact that Trump is still increasing the public pressure on Saudi Arabia, a U.S. ally, to increase its oil production is a sign that he will continue with this strongman strategy as Trump feels the pressure from the American voters to lower gas prices at home.
Well, Iran has the world's 4th largest proven oil reserves. Oil export earnings are a major part of the Iranian economy. Iranian leaders say they'll allow private companies to begin exporting to get around US sanctions. Iran earned more than $50 billion in oil exports last year. That's half its total export revenue. 60% of Iranian oil is sold to Asian countries, with China as the #1 buyer. Despite US threats, the Chinese say they'll keep on buying Iranian oil. But India says it won't. It's Iran's second biggest oil customer. European countries buy 38% of Iran's oil. EU leaders are trying to convince the US to allow their firms to continue trading with Iran without penalties, but the Trump administration insists it will not grant waivers. Well, let's bring in our guests now. Joining us from Tehran is Mohammad Marandi, Head of North American Studies Graduate Programme at the University of Tehran. From Birmingham in the UK, Scott Lucas, Professor of Political Science, International Studies and American Politics at the University of Birmingham. And from London is Anjli Raval, Oil and Gas Correspondent for the Financial Times. A very warm welcome to all of you. Ms. Raval, I'm going to start with you. Has OPEC been artificially manipulating oil prices, or does President Trump not understand oil markets?
Well, this is what's really funny at the moment, because producers came together to cut production over the last year in order to stabilize the oil market. In fact, that's also helped big US shale producers as well. So even as Donald Trump has been saying, look, Saudi Arabia and other OPEC producers are manipulating the market, it's actually also leaning on OPEC now to raise production. So he can't really have it both ways.
Mr. Lucas, what effect will the president's actions, whether it's attacking OPEC, asking them to increase production beyond their agreements, or imposing sanctions on Iranian oil, what is that going to do to oil markets and the prices?
Well, there's actually 2 levels here. And I actually think that Trump's call on Saudi Arabia to increase production by 2 million barrels per day, it's a bit of grandstanding and it's a bit of distraction from the real story. Because that second level, which is at working level, is that OPEC has agreed to raise production by up to 1 million barrels per day, which will, of course, cover for the pressure on Iranian falling exports caused by the U.S. sanctions. So there has been a little bit of de facto cooperation between the Americans and OPEC, which is putting pressure on Iran to the point where Iranian oil exports could fall by up to 40%, from 2.5 million barrels to 1.5 million barrels per day. In other words, that 1 million barrels per day that OPEC is increasing production by in the near future.
Mr. Marandi, how is this going to impact Iran increasing production, especially given that the US president is saying that he's going to sanction countries and companies that do business with Iran that buy Iranian oil?
It remains to be seen what sort of impact it has on Iranian oil exports. On the one hand, Iran is moving to secure its partners, countries like China and even India, to make sure that its exports are not hurt very badly. And I think it's also in the interest of many of these countries to make sure that they don't put all their eggs in the Saudi basket, because Saudi Arabia is not doing very well. It is not a very stable country. Mohammed bin Salman has been very erratic in his policies, and they are not winning a very expensive war in Yemen. So those countries who wish to put all their eggs in the Saudi basket could face severe problems if there's any form of instability in the Arabian Peninsula. But on the other hand, I think the Iranians are also looking for innovative ways to export their oil. Remember, the crippling sanctions that Obama imposed on Iran a few years ago, which, like Trump, his attempt was to make ordinary Iranians suffer as much as possible. That was the objective. Back then, Iran was caught off guard, more or less. It was the first time that such sanctions had ever been imposed on an oil-producing country, or on any country for that matter almost. And the Iranians initially lost a lot of their exports, but gradually, over a year, their exports were rising. And Obama himself admitted that if the United States had continued to impose those sanctions, the sanctions regime would have fallen apart. And under Trump, it's going to be in some ways even more difficult than Obama to keep countries in line, because Trump has antagonized so many people.
Mr. Lucas, I can see you wanting to come in here. I do want to ask you how much pressure you think this is putting on Iran, even if we haven't seen an impact just yet, as Mr. Marandi is saying. The Trump administration has imposed a deadline of the 4th of November on oil buyers to cut off purchases from Iran. Representatives from India and China representatives from the US, rather, are going to India and China to persuade them to stop completely. Are these countries going to listen to the US?
Yeah, I was smiling because it's very interesting to hear my good friend Mohammad give what is the official Iranian state line, that we can survive this. There's two issues with that. The first is, this isn't just a Saudi decision. This was a decision by OPEC. And it was not only a decision by OPEC, it was a decision by OPEC and by Russia, a nominal ally of Iran, to increase oil production. So simply saying it's a choice between Saudi and Iran that's misleading. The second is that the American pressure combined with internal Iranian problems is already having an effect. So two of India's largest refiners, one which is owned by the Russians, have said they're going to stop taking Iranian oil from November. Shippers and insurers are already saying, we aren't going to move the oil starting in the autumn. Now, the Iranian state line will be, we can find a private market, we can find private buyers and move this. One, that's not very easy to do, given the sophistication you need to move oil in an international market. And two, if they start trying to move oil privately, it's not only trying to defy the US, it's trying to defy OPEC.
Ms. Raval, just how much pressure is Iran under now? We've already spoken about India is not going to buy as much oil, if any oil, from Iran. Not sure what China's going to do. What about European nations? I mean, they're even more susceptible, aren't they, to US sanctions than India and China?
Exactly right. If you are a European refiner with any form of a US interest, you're going to be watching this situation very, very carefully, because the last thing you want is, even though European governments might be saying, look, you can carry on your transactions, if there are some banking sanctions or any form of secondary sanctions further down the line being imposed on these companies, they will be looking at this very, very warily. So you can see why everyone is operating in a very cautious environment.
Mr. Marandi, what do you make of all of that? You know, that's certainly painting a very bleak picture for Iran. And if all of this pressure is to force Iran to make a new nuclear deal, to rethink what it's doing in the region, in Syria, in Yemen, is it going to have that effect? What cards does Iran have now?
Well, I would like to first point out that any narrative that runs inconsistent with the American narrative is not the official Iranian narrative, and I think that's a bit insulting. What is quite clear is that the Iranians are being confronted with an aggressive regime, the United States, that is trying to crush the country. We see people like both Democrats and Republicans both saying so. We saw that the MEK terrorist organization, when they gathered in Paris just the other day, we saw Nancy Pelosi support them, as well as Giuliani and Newt Gingrich. And Giuliani admitted that the MEK, there are people in Albania, they have thousands of people who fought for Saddam Hussein, that they are trying to create unrest in Iran. So the unrest that we've seen, that your American guest is alluding to, is manufactured from abroad. So we do have war being waged on Iran.
So, Mr. Marandi, are you saying that the protests that are continuing in Iran, that we saw just last week, you know, the same week that OPEC decided that to increase production, have nothing to do with how tough living conditions are for Iranians at the moment? That you're saying they're completely manufactured from the outside?
No, I think you should be wary about how you interpret what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that, as Giuliani said, he admitted that these are not spontaneous. And the United States has been waging propaganda warfare against Iran for many years now. So we have many Persian language channels that are beaming into Iran 24 hours a day, funded or owned by Western governments. And we have a financial warfare campaign against the Iranians going on. It's been ongoing for decades now. But under Trump, he's taken it a step further. So Giuliani has admitted that it's not spontaneous. He has a big mouth, and sometimes some things come out which reveal more than he should reveal. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the Americans are definitely going to make life more difficult for Iranians. But I think that is a sign in itself that the Islamic Republic of Iran is a very stable country which has popular support. Otherwise, what the United States has been trying to do, both under Obama and Trump and Bush before them, is that they've been trying to make Iranians suffer so much that they will basically overthrow the political order. In other words, under normal circumstances, they know that they cannot do such a thing.
Mr. Lucas, let me put the same question I put to Mr. Marandi to you. Do you think that the pressure, the very real pressure that we're seeing on Iran at the moment, is it going to force it back to the negotiating table for a new nuclear deal, or rethink its participation in regional conflicts?
No, it will not force Iran back to negotiate with the Americans. The Trump administration doesn't want to negotiate. It will not immediately change Iran's policy in the region. But that's because we have two competing false narratives that are both using sanctions. The U.S. false narrative, which is the Trump administration one, is we are going to change the regime in Iran. And Mohammad Marandi is absolutely right. That is the Trump administration's goal. But the false narrative from the Iranian hardliner side is to use the sanctions to tell Iranian people, all these economic problems you have, all these social issues you have, all these concerns about the environment that you've had for years, it's all created by the foreign enemies. It's all created by the Americans or the British or Persian language channels. And of course, it's not. It's actually Iranian people who have these concerns. So you've got the Iranian people who don't necessarily want the overthrow of the system, but they want an accountable system that addresses their concerns, being caught in between Washington and the Islamic Republic's elite at this point.
Ms. Raval, let me bring you in now because I do want to talk more about Trump's motives for his actions and what he's been saying towards OPEC, because they're not just about squeezing Iran, but also about keeping oil prices low as those midterm elections approach in November. How much, is that a factor?
I think it's a really big factor, particularly at the moment. We're going into the big US holiday driving season in the summer months. So there's always one eye on domestic fuel prices. He's trying to ensure that OPEC is listening in, making sure they ramp up oil production. As Khalid al-Faleh, the Saudi energy minister, said when we were all in Vienna, look, we have to pay attention to Donald Trump's tweets because he's reflecting the concerns of the average US consumer. Just as politicians from India and elsewhere have been calling the Saudis to say, look, you better figure this out. You've got oil prices rising towards $80. That's benchmark Brent crude. So the domestic fuel prices are really, really important here.
And Mr. Lucas, could domestic fuel prices actually cost Trump politically, cost him Republican support? Would they connect his policies to higher prices?
I think if the economy continues to ride the wave, which really started in the last years of the Obama administration and has been artificially boosted by the tax cut, which is a huge gamble, but I think if the Trump administration can ride that through November, a rise in gas prices, especially once we get into the autumn, isn't going to make a huge difference. But if the American economy starts to sag, if there are other issues, such as the Russia investigation, that complicate this, then of course any issue becomes one in which the Trump administration could become vulnerable.
And Mr. Marandi, the American economy is doing well, the Iranian economy isn't. Again, what are its plans now as production rises, as it faces sanctions, to get around all of this?
Well, first I'd like to point something out, and that is that it's really helpful to people like Trump when caricatures of Iran are created by people in the West. And Iran is a country, you can't become an expert on Iran without knowing at least the language. You can't go to a Persian restaurant and become an Iranian expert. Iran is a complicated society, and there are many checks and balances in Iran. And there are many political parties fighting it out as we speak over accountability and government corruption, just as the current administration was doing the same with the previous administration. We have a very sophisticated country with popular votes, with elections, with all of our leaders elected directly and indirectly by the people. And as I said earlier, the very fact that the Americans are trying to strangle Iran, both under this regime, the Trump regime, and previous regimes, is, I think, a sign of Iran's inherent strength. But I think what the Iranians are going to do is that they are going to try to rely more on local production, and I think the administration is going to move away from liberal economics and move towards creating a larger map for a larger net for those who are vulnerable. And I think that also the fall of the Iranian rial, although it was very hurtful, I think in the long run it was inevitable because all of our administrations, both past and present, they have always made the mistake of artificially propping up the rial, and that has always hurt local industries, and they've always done it for political reasons. Because of what Trump did, the rial has collapsed, and in a sense, Trump helped the government because it would have collapsed at some point, and people would have blamed the administration, but now at least Trump gets part of the blame. So I think it's going to make Iranian goods more competitive, the Iranians more capable in exporting. It's going to be difficult. Yeah. There's no doubt about that. But I think after initial difficulty, the Iranian oil exports will gradually increase. They will regain most of their market. but they will have to sell their oil at a
Mr.
discount.
Lucas.
And increasingly, I think the Iranians are going to be selling more oil to China in yuan because Iran's most important trading partner is China. So therefore, I don't see that the United States will have any success in any way or form. And I think if we look at accountability over the past few years and decades, what Americans have been saying about Iran being weak, despotic, about to collapse, none of those have been turned out to be true.
All right, Mr. Marandi,
And
I would
think
like
that
to go
in a
to
couple
Mr.
of years'
Lucas
time, if we are on this show again, we'll see that Iran will be around.
I would like to go to Mr. Lucas now because I can see that you completely disagree again with what Mr. Marandi is saying in the very positive prospects for Iran.
I actually agree this is a really serious issue for Iranians, and it is very important to pay respect to the people there. But what you've just heard was sort of an economic mishmash and sort of like all's going to be okay, which is pretty much the line of the Supreme Leader, just trust in the resistance economy. This isn't a question of taking a political point of view, it's facing reality, and that is that the Iranian economy whose currency has dropped 85%, the Iranian economy which has had severe problems with corruption and mismanagement, that the Rouhani government's ability to deal with those economic issues is now boxed in by a very aggressive Trump administration and by hardliners in Iran, including those around the Supreme Leader, who really are using this to sort of push Iranian people to the edge of this.
So, Mr. Lucas,
it was only a few days ago that the Iranian Supreme Leader's military advisor...
What should Iranian leaders do then?
I mean, the Iranian leaders or the Iranian government's approach, the Rouhani government, was to reach out to the European Union in particular, to reach out to Europeans to offset the American pressure, and that is to try to maintain trade and investment. And they were having some limited success with that, but it's a very long road to hoe. What's happened in the last 2 weeks is that the combination of the very aggressive Trump administration and of hardline pressure on the Rouhani government is closing off that option of trying to balance the Americans not only with China, not only with India, but with the Europeans.
Really untrue.
And I really think we are getting to the point where we are not talking about...
You're trying to blame the Iranians for something that the Americans have done. The reality on the ground is that the Iranian leader, he said very explicitly that the United States, if it faithfully carries out the nuclear agreement, then the Iranians are willing to negotiate with the Americans on other issues. Have the decency to be at least honest about what happens in Iran and what Iranians say.
Mr. Lucas, go ahead.
I think you've missed my point, Mohammad. I think you missed my point. What I was saying is that far from trying to blame anyone, that the Rouhani government was trying to save the nuclear deal and therefore save the Iranian economy from its perspective by going to other countries and trying to isolate the United States. The problem is that the Iranian position, which is we can just use a resistance economy. We don't need necessarily to work with the Europeans. Yep. We don't need necessarily to try to take this option. Let's just be tough.
All right,
Mr.
Mr.
Lucas, risking isolating the Rouhani government rather than Washington.
We have about a minute left in the program, and I would like to give Ms. Raval the last word on this. Where are oil markets, oil prices going, and is Donald Trump going to succeed in both punishing Iran and keeping prices low?
It's a really hard task. Saudi Arabia, which holds like the largest amount of spare production capacity, which is 2 million barrels a day, has traditionally never gone that far because it knows that it needs the extra supply buffer if there are any major outages elsewhere in the world. So it really has been reluctant to do that in the past. And let's note that Saudi officials have not actually agreed publicly to raise production by 2 million barrels a day. Let's also remember that if it does increase rapidly, in fact, that's actually quite a bullish factor for the market, because you're saying to the world that if there is another outage in Libya or Venezuela, they might not be able to meet it.
All right, Ms. Raval, thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but thank you to all of our guests, Mohammad Marandi in Tehran, Scott Lucas in Birmingham, and Anjli Raval in London. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/ @AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From the Elizabeth Puranam and the whole team here, bye for now.